He was once sentenced to death for murder. He spent 13 years in prison. And when he finally walked free, he went on to found the settlement that would become Soweto, one of the most famous townships on earth, by leading thousands of homeless people onto vacant land in the middle of the night, riding a white horse at the head of the crowd. His name was James Mpanza, but almost everyone came to know him by another name, Sofasonke, we shall all die together. Where that extraordinary nickname came from is a story in itself, and we'll get to it. Welcome to Peak World. If you're new here, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. James Mpanza was born on the 15th of May 1889 in Georgedale, near Pietermaritzburg, in what is now KwaZulu-Natal. His father worked as an ox wagon driver, transporting goods across Natal at a time when railways had not yet reached every community. When James was still young, his father died, leaving his mother to support the family alone by working as a domestic servant. Life was difficult, but James showed intelligence from an early age. Growing up near Pietermaritzburg, he mixed freely with white children around his school, learning to speak fluent English at a time when that was unusual for many African children. That ability would later help him find employment and communicate confidently with officials throughout his life. He later attended Adams College near Amanzimtoti, one of Southern Africa's best-known mission schools. There he developed another passion, football. He played for the school's team, the Shooting Stars, and quickly became one of its biggest attractions. According to people who knew him, crowds loved watching him play. Supporters nicknamed him Man o' Men. Some accounts even recalled that young women would gather simply to watch him, shouting his nickname whenever he touched the ball. Everything suggested he had a promising future ahead. But in 1907, his education came to an abrupt end. His mother could no longer afford the school fees. Forced to leave school, Mpanza found work in a lawyer's office while continuing his education part-time. Eventually, he earned a basic teaching certificate. By the time he was in his late teens, he had become a clerk and interpreter in a respected Johannesburg legal office. For a young black South African living under segregation, this represented a remarkable achievement. On paper, his future looked secure, but appearances can be deceptive. In 1912, he was convicted of fraud. 2 years later, his life collapsed completely. In 1914, Mpanza was convicted of murdering an Indian shopkeeper. He always denied the accusation. During his appeal, he insisted he had been somewhere else when the killing occurred. Whether he was guilty or innocent remains debated by historians. What cannot be disputed is the sentence handed down by the court: death. His execution date was set. Eventually, however, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Instead of the gallows, he entered South Africa's prison system. He would spend the next 13 years behind bars. Prison was harsh. He was transferred repeatedly after clashing with prison officials and warders. But something unexpected happened during those long years of confinement. While imprisoned at Cinderella Prison in Boksburg toward the end of the First World War, Mpanza experienced what he later described as a profound religious conversion. The man who had entered prison as a convicted criminal began spending much of his time reading the Bible. He started preaching to fellow prisoners. He even wrote a small religious booklet explaining his Christian beliefs. For many inmates, prison hardened them. For Mpanza, prison appeared to transform him. When he was finally released in 1927, he was nearly 40 years old. He had lost 13 years of his life, but he walked out with an entirely different purpose. From prisoner to the father of Soweto. When James Mpanza walked out of prison in 1927, South Africa had changed dramatically. The First World War had ended. Johannesburg's gold mines were expanding rapidly, and thousands of black South Africans were leaving the countryside in search of work. Yet, while industry was growing, opportunities for African families remained tightly controlled. racial segregation was becoming more deeply entrenched, and cities were increasingly determined to regulate where black people could live, work, and even move. Mpanza returned to society with little more than his faith and his determination to rebuild his life. For a time, he worked as a teacher in Pretoria, hoping to leave his troubled past behind. Teaching offered stability, but it wasn't where history would remember him. In 1934, he moved permanently to Johannesburg. The city was unlike anywhere else in southern Africa. Gold had transformed Johannesburg into one of the fastest-growing cities on the continent. Every year, thousands of people arrived hoping to find employment in the mines, factories, railways, and construction industry. But while white neighborhoods continued to expand with proper roads, electricity, and brick houses, African families faced a completely different reality. Housing simply did not exist in sufficient numbers. The city expected black workers to provide the labor that fueled Johannesburg's prosperity, yet it refused to provide adequate places for them to live. Many families rented tiny backyard rooms. Others squeezed several households into single dwellings. Entire families often shared one or two cramped rooms without running water or proper sanitation. This housing crisis would shape James Mpanza's future more than any other event. He settled in Orlando, one of Johannesburg's newest African townships. Orlando itself had been created by the Johannesburg City Council to relocate black residents removed from older inner-city neighborhoods such as Bertram's, Prospect Township, and Doornfontein. Although presented as an improvement, Orlando quickly became overcrowded. The number of people arriving far exceeded the number of houses being built. Mpanza immediately noticed the growing crisis. He also noticed something else. The people desperately needed someone willing to challenge the authorities. His personality made him impossible to ignore. He often rode through Orlando on a magnificent white horse, an image that became legendary throughout the township. Children would run alongside him. Adults stopped to greet him. His confidence, charisma, and willingness to confront officials made him one of Orlando's most recognizable figures. Long before he became nationally famous, he had already become a local celebrity. Unlike many community leaders who limited themselves to petitions and speeches, Mpanza preferred direct action. But before confronting the government, he first tried working within the existing system. He became a member of the Orlando Advisory Board, one of the few official bodies through which black residents could communicate with Johannesburg's white municipal government. The board possessed almost no real political power. It could make recommendations, it could submit complaints, but it could not force the city council to act. Even so, Mpanza used every opportunity available to him. In 1935, he established the Sofasonke party, adopting the slogan, "Housing and Shelter for All." It was an ambitious promise. Unlike the African National Congress, which concentrated primarily on national political rights, Mpanza focused on immediate everyday problems. Where would ordinary families sleep? How could parents raise children without homes? How could communities survive if basic shelter was treated as a privilege instead of a necessity? These questions became the driving force behind his politics. Throughout the late 1930s, Mpanza repeatedly appealed to municipal authorities. He wrote letters, he attended meetings, he spoke publicly. Again and again, he warned that Orlando was approaching a breaking point. Officials listened politely. Then they did almost nothing. If conditions were already bad before the Second World War, they became dramatically worse after 1939. The war transformed Johannesburg into an industrial powerhouse. Factories producing equipment and supplies for the Allied war effort expanded rapidly. Manufacturing jobs multiplied. Mining production increased. Thousands more African workers poured into the city looking for employment. The population exploded almost overnight. Yet, while factories expanded, housing construction virtually stopped. Building materials such as cement, steel and timber were diverted toward the war effort. The Johannesburg City Council argued that there simply were not enough resources to continue constructing African housing. For the people living in Orlando, however, that explanation offered little comfort. Families continued arriving every week, backyards filled with makeshift shacks. Some people slept in overcrowded rooms, others lived under sheets of corrugated iron. Sanitation deteriorated. Disease became a growing concern. Children grew up surrounded by overcrowding that seemed to worsen every year. Mpanza watched the crisis unfold with increasing frustration. He continued writing letters to government officials. He appealed to newspapers. He demanded emergency housing projects. He warned repeatedly that desperate people could not wait forever. His warnings were ignored. To city administrators, housing Africans remained a low priority. To Mpanza, it had become a moral emergency. He later concluded that if the authorities refused to solve the problem, ordinary people would have to solve it themselves. That decision would change the history of Johannesburg forever. In early 1944, Mpanza quietly began organizing. He spoke to church groups. He met with families living in overcrowded backyards. He visited laborers who had nowhere permanent to sleep. Word spread quickly. There was finally someone willing to act instead of simply talking. Thousands expressed interest. The plan itself was astonishingly simple. Nearby lay large areas of vacant municipal land. The government owned it. Nobody lived there. Mpanza argued that land serving no purpose while thousands of families remained homeless was morally indefensible. If the city refused to build homes, then the people would occupy the land themselves. Everything depended upon speed and numbers. A handful of squatters could easily be removed. Thousands would present a completely different challenge. One evening in April 1944, Mpanza gathered enormous crowds outside his Orlando home. Entire families attended. Many carried their few possessions. Others arrived with timber, blankets, sacks, and basic tools. Everyone understood what was about to happen. If they succeeded, they would finally have somewhere to build homes. If they failed, they risked arrest, eviction, or worse. Standing before the crowd, Mpanza addressed them with remarkable confidence. They had waited long enough. Nobody else was coming to rescue them. If they wanted dignity, they would have to claim it themselves. Then, as dawn approached, James Mpanza climbed onto his famous white horse. Behind him stretched thousands of men, women, and children. Together, they began walking toward the vacant land. By sunrise, one of the largest organized land occupations in South African history had begun. And within hours, Johannesburg would discover that James Sofasonke Mpanza had transformed from a local activist into one of the most influential community leaders the city had ever seen. By sunrise, thousands of people had crossed onto vacant municipal land. There was no official permission, no legal title, no guarantee they would still be there by the end of the day. Yet almost immediately, the empty ground sprang to life. Families unloaded everything they owned. Men cut poles from nearby trees. Women stretched old Hessian sacks over wooden frames. Children gathered scrap timber, pieces of corrugated iron, cardboard, and wire. Within hours, hundreds of makeshift homes had appeared where there had been nothing the night before. By the end of the first day, the city was confronted with a reality it had never expected. This wasn't a handful of squatters. It was an entire community, and every hour that passed made removing them more difficult. The settlement became known by several names. Some called it Masakeni, meaning the place of sacks, because so many of the homes were built from Hessian grain sacks stitched together into crude walls. Others simply called it Shantytown, but increasingly people referred to it as Sofasonke village, after the man who had led them there. It was here that James Mpanza earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Addressing his followers, he warned them that nobody should expect an easy victory. The government might send police. The authorities might destroy their homes. Some people might even lose everything they had managed to build. If that happened, they would face it together. Again and again, he repeated the words, Sofasonke. We shall all die together. It was never intended as a call for violence. It was an expression of solidarity. If the authorities wanted to crush the settlement, they would have to confront everyone, not just one family or one leader. The phrase spread rapidly through the camp. Soon people stopped calling him James Mpanza. To thousands of residents, he simply became Sofasonke. As more homeless families arrived, the settlement expanded almost every day. Rows of shacks stretched across the landscape. Footpaths became streets. Open ground became neighborhoods. Within months, thousands of people were living there. Within 2 years, the population had grown to well over 20,000. It had become one of the largest informal settlements anywhere in South Africa. Remarkably, the community did not descend into complete chaos. Mpanza understood that survival required organization. He established a small headquarters known simply as the office. From there, residents could bring disputes, seek assistance, or ask for advice. He organized volunteers to patrol the settlement at night. They acted as a community police force, discouraging theft and helping maintain order in a place where the official authorities provided almost no services. Residents also created systems of mutual support. Families shared food with neighbors who had none. Coal was purchased collectively in bulk to reduce costs. People looked after each other's children while parents searched for work. Although conditions remained desperately poor, a genuine community spirit emerged. One song echoed repeatedly throughout the settlement. Mazulu, Mshosa, Msuthu Langanani. Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, stand together. Those words reflected something remarkable. The settlement brought together people from many different ethnic backgrounds. Under ordinary circumstances, tribal identities often remained strong. But homelessness created a common struggle that crossed those divisions. For perhaps the first time on such a large scale, ordinary working-class Africans from different communities began living, organizing, and fighting side by side. It was exactly the kind of unity that later became central to South Africa's broader liberation movement. Yet life inside Sofasonke village was far from perfect. Mpanza governed the settlement with enormous personal authority. Anyone wanting a residential plot paid a registration fee. Residents also contributed small weekly payments. In return, they received protection from the community patrols and access to Mpanza's informal courts. These courts settled arguments between neighbors. They dealt with family disputes. They handled disagreements over property boundaries. Many historians believe these community tribunals became the forerunners of the informal parents' courts, or magotla, that still exist in parts of Soweto today. To many residents, Mpanza's system brought order where the government had provided none. But not everyone agreed. Critics argued that he exercised too much personal control. Some believed he behaved more like the ruler of a private kingdom than the leader of a democratic movement. Researchers who later studied his career described his leadership as highly charismatic but also deeply personal. Loyalty often centered on Mpanza himself rather than on permanent institutions. Others questioned whether it was fair to collect money from people who were already desperately poor. After all, the land belonged to the city. The housing crisis had been created by government policy. Should homeless families have been paying anyone simply to occupy vacant land? These criticisms have remained part of Mpanza's legacy ever since. Yet one fact could not be ignored. The authorities had spent years discussing the housing crisis. James Mpanza had actually done something about it. As news of the occupation spread across Johannesburg, municipal officials found themselves facing an impossible dilemma. Removing a few illegal structures would have been relatively straightforward. Removing more than 20,000 people was another matter entirely. Every eviction risked violence. Every delay encouraged even more families to arrive. The government initially tried intimidation. Officials threatened prosecutions. They declared the occupation illegal. New laws were proposed to strengthen powers against squatters. But none of it solved the underlying problem. The people simply had nowhere else to go. Eventually, the Johannesburg City Council accepted what had become obvious. The occupation could no longer be ignored. In 1945, the city identified nearby land at Jabavu for formal housing development. According to several historical accounts, mining magnate Ernest Oppenheimer helped finance the project through a substantial loan. Whether motivated by humanitarian concern or practical necessity, the decision marked a turning point. For the first time, the authorities acknowledged that large-scale housing for African families could no longer be postponed indefinitely. The settlements that followed gradually evolved into what? The proposal never succeeded. Soweto became the official name, but the fact that people seriously considered naming an entire township after James Mpanza reveals just how influential he had become. By the mid-1940s, Mpanza was no longer simply a housing activist. He had become one of the most powerful grassroots leaders in Johannesburg. His influence reached far beyond Orlando. Young political activists increasingly took notice of his methods. Among them were rising members of the ANC Youth League, including Walter Sisulu, Anton Lembede, and a young law student named Nelson Mandela. Although their politics sometimes differed, they recognized something important. James Mpanza had demonstrated that ordinary people, when organized, could force even an unwilling government to respond. It was a lesson that would shape the next generation of resistance. But Mpanza's own story was far from over. The victories of the 1940s would soon be overshadowed by a new political era. In 1948, the National Party came to power. Apartheid became official government policy, and James Mpanza would soon face the most controversial chapter of his entire life. A hero, a collaborator, or both? For a brief moment in the mid-1940s, James Sofasonke Mpanza appeared unstoppable. His land occupation had forced the authorities to acknowledge Johannesburg's housing crisis. Thousands of families who had once been homeless now had communities of their own, and Mpanza had become one of the best-known grassroots leaders in South Africa. But history was about to change. In 1948, the National Party came to power and formally introduced apartheid. Although racial segregation had existed for decades, apartheid transformed it into a comprehensive system of law. Every aspect of life, where people could live, work, study, travel, and even whom they could marry, became increasingly controlled by the state. The political landscape changed almost overnight. The African National Congress began shifting toward mass national resistance. A younger generation of leaders, including Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and later Robert Sobukwe, increasingly focused on dismantling apartheid itself rather than fighting isolated local battles. Mpanza's politics had always been different. He was never primarily an ideological politician. He was a practical organizer. His greatest concern had always been housing, sanitation, and the daily survival of ordinary people. As national politics became more confrontational, his style of leadership began to seem increasingly old-fashioned. His relationship with the authorities remained complicated. In 1946, even before apartheid officially began, the government attempted to deport him back to Natal. Officials regarded him as a dangerous agitator whose influence over Johannesburg's African population had become too great. Mpanza refused to accept the order. Instead, he challenged it in court. Remarkably, he won. The decision allowed him to remain in Orlando and was widely viewed as an important legal victory at a time when black South Africans rarely succeeded against the state. Yet the greatest controversy of his career still lay ahead. During the 1960s, the apartheid government introduced a series of local administrative bodies for black townships. One of these was the Soweto Urban Bantu Council. Officially, the government claimed these councils would allow township residents to manage certain local affairs. In reality, they possessed almost no meaningful political power. They could not challenge apartheid. They could not legislate. They remained entirely subordinate to the white government. Many anti-apartheid activists rejected the councils outright. To them, participation meant giving legitimacy to a system designed to deny black South Africans genuine democracy. James Mpanza saw the situation differently. Whether out of pragmatism, frustration, or genuine belief, he argued that imperfect institutions could still deliver practical improvements for ordinary residents. If participation meant more houses, better roads, improved sanitation, or expanded public services, then perhaps it was worth engaging. It was a position that divided opinion sharply. Supporters argued that Mpanza had always cared more about solving problems than making political statements. They believed he remained consistent with the principles that had guided him since the 1930s. Critics reached a very different conclusion. They accused him of cooperating with apartheid institutions at precisely the moment when resistance needed unity. To many within the liberation movement, working with the Urban Bantu Council risked strengthening the very system that oppressed black South Africans. The controversy intensified when Mpanza hoped to become the council's first mayor after its establishment in 1968. He believed his decades of community leadership made him the natural choice. Instead, someone else was appointed. Those close to him later recalled that the disappointment affected him deeply. It was one of the few ambitions he never achieved. Yet while politics became increasingly controversial, another part of Mpanza's legacy continued growing almost unnoticed. Years earlier, in 1937, he had established the Orlando Boys Club. The purpose was simple: give young people discipline, give them sport, give them somewhere to belong. 2 years later, in 1939, that club adopted a new name, Orlando Pirates Football Club. Few people at the time could have imagined what it would become. Today, Orlando Pirates is one of Africa's most successful and most passionately supported football clubs, with millions of supporters across South Africa and beyond. Every time Pirates take the field, they carry a small piece of James Mpanza's legacy with them. Even the club's famous nickname, Ezimnyama Nkani, often translated as the Defiant Blacks or the ones who are black by force, has frequently been linked to Mpanza's own fearless and uncompromising reputation. Long before football made the name famous, Mpanza himself had become a symbol of defiance. By the late 1960s, however, his health was beginning to decline. The man who had once ridden proudly through Orlando on his white horse was growing older. South Africa itself was changing rapidly. A younger generation of activists was preparing for struggles that would culminate in the Soweto uprising of 1976. Many of them knew little about the extraordinary land occupation that had helped create the township in which they now lived. James Mpanza died in 1970 at his home in Orlando East. He was 81 years old. His funeral reflected the remarkable influence he had exercised over Johannesburg for decades. Thousands of mourners lined the streets. The funeral procession passed through township after township before reaching Doornkop Cemetery in Jabulani. For many residents, they were not simply burying a political leader, they were saying goodbye to the man they regarded as the father of Soweto. His political organization, the Sofasonke Party, survived him. In the 1971 township elections, it won a majority of council seats and remained active for almost 2 more decades. His former home has since been declared a heritage site. Orlando Stadium, whose construction grew from a proposal Mpanza himself submitted to city officials in 1958, still stands today. Perhaps his greatest monument, however, is not a building at all. It is Soweto itself, a township that became home to millions. A township that produced Nobel Peace Prize winners Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. A township that became the international symbol of resistance during the struggle against apartheid. None of that history begins with James Mpanza alone. But it is difficult to imagine it unfolding in quite the same way without him. His life remains deeply complicated. He was a convicted murderer who always maintained his innocence. A prisoner who became a preacher. A preacher who became a housing activist. A housing activist who led one of the largest land occupations in South African history. A champion of poor communities whose leadership style was sometimes criticized as authoritarian. A man celebrated as the father of Soweto who later chose to work within institutions created by the apartheid state. History rarely gives us perfect heroes. James Mpanza is no exception. His legacy forces us to ask difficult questions. Should leaders be judged only by the systems they opposed, or also by the practical improvements they achieved for ordinary people? Perhaps James Sofasonke Mpanza's greatest achievement was proving that ordinary citizens, acting together, could change the course of history long before governments were willing to do so. His methods remain debated. His decisions remain controversial, but his impact is undeniable. Without James Mpanza, there may never have been a Soweto as the world came to know it. What do you think James Mpanza should be remembered for most? Was he a visionary housing activist who transformed the lives of thousands, or did his later cooperation with apartheid-era institutions complicate his legacy beyond repair? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this documentary, please like this video, subscribe to Peak World, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story from African history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.